So Bethany Stolle is the founder of Stolle Creative and is an interaction designer, curriculum developer, and design evangelist. After nearly a decade in religious publishing with a focus on developing youth ministry resources, she now works as a senior designer with Blackboard, leading research projects and creating apps to help students learn. Bethany is passionate about meaning making, telling stories, creating with others, and using design to address wicked problems. So Bethany, again, we are so excited that you are able to join the eFormation community and to really have us think about how design thinking and theology intersect. And I'm so looking forward to learning from you and being inspired by you. So I will go ahead and pass the mic over and we can spend the next 60 minutes learning.
Great. Everything's sounding good? Can you hear me? I'll take that as a yes. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction and for the invitation to be part of today. I'm really excited to join you because for the past decade, I have had a foot in the world of design and in the worlds of faith formation. And increasingly, I've seen these two worlds overlapping, which is very exciting for me. These days, as Sarah mentioned, in addition to working as an interaction designer and design researcher for Blackboard, which is an educational technology company, I love to work with religious and nonprofit groups to do design research, strategy, and consulting. Before that, I spent about a decade developing curriculum for children and youth and adults, first at Augsburg Fortress and then with the Spark House division. So I've seen a lot of shifts in how technology is shaping learning and faith formation. And I think there are some distinct frameworks and tools from the world of design and design thinking that could really serve us as ministry leaders. So first, before we get far, I want to make sure we're working from the same text. If you have a moment, type in the chat, what do you think of when you hear the word design? I mentioned I'm an interaction designer, but the world of design is big and confusing. So I want to get a sense of what design means to you. So if anyone can post in the chat. Apple computers, iPhones, creating, color, creation, usability, meeting people where they are, imagination, design and aesthetics, good stuff. Planning, public spaces, visual, great. Keep them coming. I'll check in on that in a few minutes. But we've got a number of different examples. A lot of times when people hear that I'm a designer, they think of fashion design, although maybe I'm not as fashionable as they would interpret. Or they might think of interior design or graphic design. Some people mention usability or web or app design. Usually we go to a place of thinking about form and aesthetics and styling. And then increasingly, given the rise in technology and design-driven companies like Apple, people think of usability and innovation when they hear the word design. What I would like to talk about is the way Roberto Verganti defines design. He's an educator and a designer and a scholar, and he returns to the Latin root of the word design, designare, which means to give meaning to things. So he goes on to say, design is not about styling, it's not about technology, it's about radical change in meaning. These are things that people were not asking for, but when they saw them, they fell in love. So maybe you have a smartphone in your pocket or on your desk or in your hand right now. Maybe you're using it at this very moment, but I'm curious I'd like for you to think about how much time you spend making phone calls on your smartphone. Maybe you make calls, but I would surmise that a large percentage of your time or your phone battery goes to non-call activities. But thanks to the design of the smartphone from Apple and Android and Samsung and all those folks, the fundamental meaning of phone has shifted. And if you're still not convinced, just show a rotary phone to a 10-year-old and see what they say. This is all to say that Verganti's definition of design is closer to what I mean when I use the word design or interaction design. Form and aesthetics still matter. And I have plenty of conversations with my colleagues about color and type and animations and icons and what text should appear on the screen or a button. But I'm also deeply interested in relationships. So the relationships between people, the relationships we have with systems and technology, how we relate to one another through our technology and our systems, and what those relationships feel like. Thinking about design through the lenses of meaning and relationships, I think that gives us a better sense of how to design for humans. So basically, when I talk about interaction design, we're thinking about the interactions between people, our systems, and with one another through our technology and our systems. And also thinking about the related emotion. So that can give us a better sense of how to design for humans. I love what the researcher and professor Liz Sanders says. We are moving from the design of categories of products to designing for people's purposes. So how do we do it? How can we use the tools of design to break familiar patterns or to address problems in our ministries? So I'd like to walk through a type of design called design thinking, which is really just a method for creative action. There are a number of design thinking models from organizations like IDEO, the Stanford Design School, Frog, Austin Center for Design, and others, but most of them reference a few key moves. The first major step is ethnography. So true ethnographers and anthropologists would probably scoff at what designers call research, but we draw inspiration from those fields as we try to develop empathy for a group of people through research. Because people aren't stock photos. If you were at eFormation last year, I was very pregnant at the time. I now have a 9-month-old son, and I cannot imagine that his room will ever look anything like something from Pottery Barn Kids. Similarly, when we might imagine a user or participant or a congregation member when we're working on some new ministry idea, their reality is probably far more complex and instructive than we would think, or than a stock or a contrived photo. So design research, I want to reiterate that this is not market research. We're not trying to test the viability of an existing idea. We're not trying to generalize trends from some small population to a much larger group. Instead, generative research, ethnographic research, is problem seeking. We go into the field to meet with real people, to develop empathy and seek inspiration, and provoke new ways of understanding a problem. The next part of the process, after conducting qualitative generative research, is to make sense of it. During synthesis, designers transform the raw material, so the quotes, the stories that we heard, into insights and design ideas. It is cliche, but designers really do use a lot of sticky notes and whiteboards and bulletin boards during synthesis, because by writing quotes and stories on Post-its, we can display them, we can externalize them, and see them along with pictures from our research. And we surround ourselves with artifacts from what we see in the field. These methods are really great ways to externalize and visualize research because they're really flexible. You're not beholden to the constraints of some software engineer and what they thought the structure should be when they designed some software. You can really literally move things around and form new connections. Secondly, our brains can't hold it all. So when we post stories and quotes, it makes it easier to see both gaps in the research and how the ideas and points relate to one another. And then finally, my favorite reason is displaying research becomes an invitation. If you've ever walked into one of these sort of research war rooms or a place where all of this stuff is spewed all over the place, people are magnetically drawn to sticky notes, to the photos. They automatically go over to the board and start trying to see what's going on. And it becomes an opportunity to not only talk about the findings, but to invite a new perspective. So that's ethnography, or developing empathy, synthesizing what you heard and saw. And then the third step is prototyping, or some people would say prototyping and iteration, because this is where the ideas start to take shape through sketches, through manuscripts, through mock-ups, and you start to test them. If you've ever heard the term fail fast, that's really what's happening in this step of the process. It's counter to our impulse to maybe hide in a room somewhere and not emerge until we've crafted the perfect ministry experience or some other perfection. But a lot of designers, well, probably all designers, start with lower fidelity prototypes, and then we test them with people. It might just be a sketch on paper or a storyboard. And then after you test and get feedback from real people, you iterate and you continue the cycle. So each iteration gets higher and higher fidelity and the quality improves. Or in the words of my mentor and the founder of Austin Center for Design, which is where I went to design school, John Kolko says, the goal is to make and reflect, not hatch an egg. So I just love coming back to that term. I think it's really instructive for probably anyone trying to create something. While that process, those 3 steps seem straightforward, reality is much messier, as you probably know. There's a lot of divergence and convergence in the process, and sometimes you loop back to earlier steps or you discover you need to learn more. But generally, you open up possibilities early on by developing empathy. You start to narrow those down into insights and focus, and then you expand those insights out into a number of different ideas, holding as many in tension for as long as possible, until you finally narrow as you prototype and test and come up with a thing that you want to release into the world. Over my years in religious education and publishing and technology, I've seen more and more people embrace design thinking to try to break out of ruts, out of the "but it's always been done that way" phrase, to create products and services that are really oriented around the needs of and experiences of people that are part of our ministries. So a few real world examples. Swiffer. Procter & Gamble's team went into homes to observe people managing messes, and they discovered that people spent as much time cleaning their mops as they did washing their floors. And one woman in particular, after she had finished mopping, she ended up taking a paper towel to just do a quick cleanup after what was left over. And that was the seed for the Swiffer. Another story I love is around MRI machines. Pediatric patients often had to be sedated because they were afraid and couldn't hold still in a machine, but sedation on young children is actually quite risky. So the healthcare team at General Electric used the design thinking process, and it resulted in the GE Adventure series of imaging equipment. So they implemented this in some hospitals where they've painted the walls, the machines are wrapped to conceal the usual equipment, and they even pipe sound effects into the room. So this transforms what would be a scary experience into an underwater adventure or a trip into the forest, or even an exploit on a pirate ship. And the numbers of children who had to be sedated before going into the imaging machines decreased dramatically. From my own work experience, when I was at Spark House, we used the same process to look at possibilities for children's curriculum. For years, we heard laments about how volunteer teachers never prepare, they're skimming their lessons in the church parking lot, or sometimes like I did, moments before kids walked into the room. I know better, but I just didn't do better. So when we visited Sunday school classrooms, it became apparent the kids were most engaged when there was a really great engaging leader, a compelling leader. But at every church, there's always at least one person who was grabbed from a hallway and asked to sub at the very last minute, because that's the reality. So we ended up designing Holy Moly, which is a curriculum that requires minimal to no prep. And then through some videos and very visual leaflets, it invites joy and excitement. And the leader can really focus on building a relationship and facilitating and wondering right alongside the kids without having to be a Bible expert. That's all well and good, but you know, this is a group of eFormation faith people. How do we connect that back to the theology or the Bible? I want to share a story you may know about a guy named Moses. In the 3rd chapter of Exodus, Moses is tending his father-in-law's flock of sheep. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appears in a flame out of a bush. Now, this bush isn't right in Moses' path, like some street barricade up in flames. No, Moses says, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. Moses notices it and turns to get closer and investigate. At that point, when Moses ventures off his path, God calls from the bush, Moses, Moses, here I am. The Lord tells Moses to remove his sandals before coming closer, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And the Lord continues, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses, afraid to look at God, hides his face. God continues, and I love how the Message translation starts the next line. I have taken a good long look at the affliction of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries for deliverance from their slave masters. I know all about their pain. And now I have come down to help them, pry them loose from the grip of Egypt, and get them out of that country and bring them to a good land with wide open spaces, a land lush with milk and honey. The Lord has heard the cries of the Israelites, has seen and felt their oppression, and is going to take action to free the people through Moses. Now, Moses isn't totally sure about this plan. Why me? What makes you think that I'm capable of this? And he continues to offer excuses about why he's not, why he shouldn't be God's first round pick for the job. But nevertheless, Moses is called in this holy moment. He responds to the people's cry, and he proceeds to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. This story really struck me in a new way once I began studying design, because in the moment he's called, first of all, Moses is present. He notices the burning bush off to the side and is curious enough to investigate. God hears the cries of the people and empathizes with them. Their suffering compels both God and Moses into action. For me, design is a way of noticing, of building empathy and discerning how to practice ministry. So I'm going to get into some practical tips for doing design in a few moments. But first, I wanted to take a moment to see if we have any questions.
We did have a recommendation, Neil Fisher. So he recommended fail fast, the concept of fail fast he found in What Would Google Do by Jeff Jarvis. So that's another good option for continuing reading. And everyone was very intrigued as to what curriculum you worked on. And so that was Holy Moly, which is available via Spark House.
Yes, and I've also worked on Reform, a lot of the youth ministry curriculum, Collaborate. All three of those use the design thinking process.
And Greg says he would like to see the first diagram again. And this is a nice moment to remind everyone that all of the resources, including this recorded webinar, will be available after our time together. So her PowerPoint will be available, the video will be available, and also all of the resources mentioned within the chat box will also be made available.
Was it this diagram? I have.
Greg, was it this diagram that you were looking for? Can I get a yes or a no or a thumbs up? I'm not sure. Or was it the one where it was sort of like a little wave? That one. I liked that one. Oh, and he said yes, that was the one he was looking for, the one with the circles. Great. Awesome. Any other questions? The focus flare one. I think everyone is very excited about all of your graphics. Michael Gwecky, hello Michael, who you might have remembered from eFormation last year. Do you have any recommendations on how practitioners might be able to get their heads above the fray, to synthesize, and then ultimately to have the bandwidth to prototype in ministry?
That is a really good question.
That's a big question.
Ooh, and I think the tension too is trying to find space to do that. I don't know if there's ever an opportunity to do more of like a retreat format or really carve out dedicated space, because it's really difficult to be in the day-to-day and then, you know, go from the weeds up to like viewing the crop circles. I don't know if I have a really great recommendation other than I also think it's really important to try to prioritize, you know, both developing empathy and creating space for doing it. Otherwise, I think we just kind of continue to perpetuate what we're doing. I do think when it comes to the prototyping and iteration, using the term like a pilot program can kind of create space and permission. So instead of saying we're going to overhaul confirmation, which would often tend to lead to, oh, well, we need to go into a room and create perfection and then release and have a huge rollout plan. You might be able to say, okay, we want to redo, you know, one particular part, and we're going to prototype on small scale this one module, or we're going to try something with a half dozen mentors. So figure out a small, another concept that might be useful is the minimum viable product, is kind of a word from, or a concept from the business world, but figuring out what's a small discrete portion that you could start to prototype and test and iterate so it doesn't feel like it's a huge change, because the change management piece can be really difficult. And then also finding ways to draw people in the process, because if you're including more people, they're more likely to be on board because they've seen everything from the raw material, the stories, all the way through generating insights and starting to turn those into ideas. And you don't maybe have as many obstacles because people don't know the thread of where the idea came from.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with like it's okay to fail and then learn from that process. And that's something that again, as you said, ministry professionals are very, very, very hesitant to do. So uh,
Framing as a pilot or an experiment can really help give a little space and permission to try something new.
Yeah, and we actually did it as part of Employee Appreciation Day. We did a design challenge, and so that was a lot of fun, and it's a lot of communication, a lot of learning from failure. And as Kyle Oliver says, his design professor says, get it in front of people yesterday. So learn from them.
Yeah, and you can do, and that's a great point too. Like you could say we're going to do one day, just a design charrette is often, you know, just a really quick one day of going through cycles, and you can go do intercept interviews. And I've done that before where I've grabbed people on the street and asked them about formative faith experiences. Mm-hmm. Some people are resistant to that, but there are ways to do it on a small scale to try to build the tools or build the experience and get over the discomfort of talking to people about some of those things. And then get experience on a small scale. So then when you want to work on a larger project, you feel more equipped.
Yeah. Yeah. And as Kathleen points out, what a great way to get congregational buy-in of widening it out, not just the confirmation teachers in the room, but bringing in parents and former confirmands and everything. So really, really amazing. Greg asks, can you unpack again what you mean by flair or nuance it again? He says capital F flair. I don't know if that matters to you.
So a lot of times, you know, when you go out and you hear stories, you have all of these different quotes, and you've talked to a number of people, and there are all these different quotes and ideas and things out there that are starting to ruminate, and then you have some sort of criteria to say, these are the themes we heard, here are the things we want to pursue. Well, once you develop, you know, I'll talk about this in a moment, but you maybe come up with like 6 to 8 insights. Well, each of those insights could have hundreds of ideas for how you can address a particular problem. And so you try to generate a lot of different ideas, and that's the flair point. So, you know, you've narrowed down all of these different stories and identified some themes or some insights, and then you try to come up with, I mean, when I was in design school, we had to come up with 300 business ideas over the course of probably a week or so. 98% of them were horrible, but that's not the point. The point is to generate a lot of possibilities, because in those there might be some seeds of ideas that could be viable. So that's really the flair point. And then as you start to decide, okay, you know, you've gotten big, okay, here's where we want to really focus our energy and try to prototype this thing, then you start to narrow over time until you have something that you can release into the world.
Mm-hmm. 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 All right, let's keep on keeping on.
Okay, let me find, there we go. Great. So if any of you are practical theologians, this model might look familiar. I wanted to take a moment to say, you know, there's a lot of overlap between design thinking and the practical theology model, or Richard Osmer's hermeneutical circle. Osmer defines 4 tasks to consider: what's going on, why, what ought to be going on, and how to respond. So we're constantly moving between those tasks. We're acting and reflecting and acting and reflecting. And it's not even a circle, it's more of a spiral, because with each action and reflection, you're kind of progressing or moving through that spiral. So it's theory and praxis. It looks really similar to many of the design thinking models. This one is from Frog Design's Collective Action Toolkit, but you see that it's not that linear process that flare and focus thing would lead you to think. It is a much more iterative and cyclical process. So I will go back to the artificially constructed simple 3-step construct, because we only have an hour today. But I want to offer a couple methods that you can experiment with if you want to try design thinking in your own context. At the very beginning, before you start, I really suggest defining your problem space. You don't necessarily know what the actual problem is yet, and I want to clarify that, because you want to define the boundaries. We want to learn about, you know, young adults 18 to 29 or 18 to 24, and figure out how do we address the needs of college students who have left our congregation but still have some ties. You don't necessarily know how to address those problems or even what the problems are, but you're defining the space. Who do you want to learn more about? What do you want to learn from? Or who do you want to learn from and empathize with? Where can you go to seek inspiration? One of my go-to methods for problem seeking is contextual inquiry, which is pretty much what it sounds like, conducting an interview or observation in context of where the activity happens. So for example, I did one research project where I met with young adults in their homes. It feels a little odd and invasive to send a request to a stranger and ask them to let you interview them in the place where they eat and sleep and poop. But the environment offers so many clues to who they are as a person, and their environmental cues can prompt stories and questions that would never come up if you met them in some neutral third space. It offers a wider field of view. So instead of seeing the framed confirmation photo, like in this picture, you get a sense of the immense support network that's happening behind the scenes. To do contextual inquiry, I develop a list of questions, often on sticky notes, and then start to group them together in themes and get really familiar with what I want to explore. Then I set all of that aside when I actually start the interview and go into the field, and I try to be fully present, following the lead of the person that I'm meeting with and the emotion of that person. Another method I love to use involves participatory tools. So there are a number of ways to do this, but the core is to really give people tools to be creative and to express their experiences. I'll often send a brief homework assignment to the participant in advance, which primes them for the conversation. I might ask them to write about 3 recent experiences using technology to communicate with others and how it made them feel. Or maybe have them do a photo scavenger hunt that, and they send me a picture of a role model and someplace they feel close to God and that sort of thing. I've also had people write their experiences on a timeline or a spectrum from positive to negative, or from past or present looking ahead. Or I'll have them sort pictures into categories like this is my ideal experience and this is not ideal. Whatever tools I use, the intent is really to evoke stories and to equip participants with tools so that they can construct a narrative. It also provides a foundation for imagining how to change those experiences. So if it's a negative to positive spectrum and they write down a negative encounter, I can then ask, well, what would you do to change that to make that more positive? And it helps you see the gap between reality and their hope. So after developing empathy through research, the next part of the design cycle is synthesis. Here are a few methods that I like to use to interpret what I've heard and to provoke new ideas. The first is an empathy map. You can simply draw 4 quadrants on a board or a piece of paper and then start jotting down what participants said, what they thought, they felt, and they did. I sometimes add in what they heard so I can capture external messages in this context as well. This is a great tool to revisit an individual interview and share those stories, especially if you're involving people who weren't in the interview session but are part of the synthesis process. Again, the cliche sticky note photo that's mandatory for design presentation, but sticky notes are really great for affinity diagrams. For this method, you go through your notes from your interview and you pull out any observations, any stories, and any quotes that really stand out. And then you start to group them together into themes, and the clusters quickly reveal significant pain points. You might notice outliers. Sometimes you'll see a big cluster and just a few notes in another part. So you can start to visually see where trends are happening. I really like to create affinity diagrams, again, in conversation with others, because different interpretations of the same sticky note can add a richness to the process. And then a third form of synthesis, which I often will pair with affinity diagrams, is insight generation. So going back to my mentor, John Kolko, he says an insight is a provocative statement of truth that might be wrong. So you take your observations, you combine it with your experiences, with your biases, the things that you know, and you make a statement about human behavior that can inspire ideas for what to create. So an example of an insight, one of my favorites is from some research I did on play and creative problem solving. And our insight was adults are vampires to kid play. In our research, we learned that often parents don't have fun, playful outlets of their own. So when they're working alongside kids on a fun project, the parent often commandeers the project and takes over, which unfortunately robs the child of the experience. So adults are vampires to kid play. It's kind of hyperbolic, a little overstated, but it becomes a really rich way for us to think then, how do we start to address that problem?
Bethany, can you go back one slide and read one more, I think? Is this Hilton Presbyterian Church asked if they could be, the slides could be read out loud. So it's contextual inquiry, participatory tools. Oh, one more back. The request is ethnography, synthesis, and prototyping. So ethnography, synthesis, and prototyping. And again, this is a friendly little reminder that all of the slides and the videos themselves will be made available afterwards. So you will have all of these and more. So do not worry in case you miss something.
So yeah, thanks for letting me know. I'll make sure I read through the names because I get ahead of myself. So for ethnography, 2 of the methods I walk through are contextual inquiry and participatory tools. When you move into the next step of synthesis, I talked about the empathy map, affinity diagrams, and insight generation. And then the next step is prototyping and iteration. So once you've done your research and you've synthesized it, it's time to make something, to give it form, to try it out, to get feedback, and then to refine it. When I was at Spark House, we were developing a new youth ministry curriculum called Collaborate. We had done the research, visited a number of churches, met with not only pastors, but also with youth and adult mentors and their parents. We developed some insights out of that. And from that, when we got to the point of prototyping, we started with rough sketches. This is an early sketch for an infographic that went with one of the sessions. It was a really rough on a giant piece of paper in a conference room somewhere. And then over time, we started to review and refine it. So when we're designing a new curriculum, we would also, before we develop all 20, 30, 40, 60 sessions, we would work up 1 or 2 complete sessions, send them out to a number of churches to try, and then we'd integrate their feedback and iterate before we developed the full curriculum of 60 or more sessions. So that's ethnography, synthesis, and prototyping and iteration. So that's the whirlwind tour of design thinking. You may already realize this, but I want to reiterate that you are a designer. You are creating programs and events and ministry opportunities in your own context all the time. The challenge here is that as a designer, you have a disproportionate amount of power over the people who use what you create or participate in your ministries. So for me, that is one of the most valuable parts of the design thinking process, because design thinking offers a framework for leaders to subvert our own power and to bring others into the creative process. I haven't gotten too far down this thread, but really I think design thinking is a new Reformation, whereas the Reformation was about access to information in new ways, and it subverted the power dynamics of the day. I think that design thinking is taking that to the next step, where it's not just about access to information, but it's an invitation to participate in new ways. I mean, really, design could be the work of the people. So my hope is that you will be inspired to try design thinking the next time that you're facing a ministry challenge, that you'll start with empathy, that you'll synthesize what you learned, and that you'll prototype and iterate new opportunities, and do all of this in community, that you'll invite people to be part of it. You don't have to go it alone, which is the beauty of design. Whenever I'm at the start of a new design project and I go into someone's home to develop empathy, it's such a privilege to be invited in. I get to hear stories from people. I've cried with people. I've bounced babies on my lap. I actually, for a short period of time, 1, 2, 3 hours, am invited into their lives. And every time that I go into someone's home, I leave my shoes at the door because I know that I'm standing on holy ground. So I want to thank you so much. I left extra time for a final Q&A because I know this is burning through a lot. Before we dive into that, I wanted to let you know too that I'm developing a series of audio recordings and some handouts that walk through design thinking basics for ministry leaders. And I've also started to compile a list of links for my go-to articles for books and toolkits. So if you go to stollecreative.com/resources, you can find a growing list of options there.
So a few things popped in while you were talking. Let me go back. I think a pretty straightforward one is, well, a recommendation from Miranda was The Agile Church by Dwight, and I can't pronounce his last name, but I know that you can. I can't remember. The Agile Church is the name of the book. And so she recommends it is to a large extent offering design thinking to churches, Episcopal or otherwise. And then Peter Turner asked, what are some ways that you can do the sharing creatively and thinking creatively online, so that way you don't have to be in the same room. And I recommended a resource called Notely. So it's note.ly, which is an online post-it board. And so you have the exact same experience of having a corkboard and putting up post-its, and then other people can collaborate and do post-its that way. And I wasn't sure if you had another recommendation as well.
I've started to play a little bit with real-time board. Google Drive also has it's not elegant, but there is a drawing option there if you want to really manually do it, and it's free. I've used real-time board. It's limited on how many team members you can have, and then there's also Murally, which I haven't used much firsthand. A lot of them are subscriptions, so that's kind of the tension that I have.
Neil recommends Trello. And then Richard recommends MindMeister.
Yep, I've used MindMeister before too.
Yeah, so those are good options as well. Dwight Sheely, thank you, Melody. I appreciate. Everyone is sending me pronunciation guides for Dwight's last name. I appreciate everyone for sending me that. And again, his book is Agile Church. So the one person, I'm not sure, it's some communications office, says, what kind of questions, processes do you ask when gathering information through participatory tools?
Ooh, so it really depends a bit on the project. So I would say one of the easiest ones is doing like a negative to positive experience timeline, especially if you're thinking about, like when I was doing the confirmation project, we met with youth and with parents and leaders, and beforehand I had asked them to write about a meaningful conversation that they'd had about faith recently. Another priming activity for their homework was sort of a mini photo scavenger hunt. 3 questions that you'd want to ask a ministry leader. So that was to kind of prime the pump. And then we first talked through their journal activity, and then we shifted to doing a spectrum of negative to positive experiences. And I had them map out experiences for church that were, or with church that were negative to positive. And then we kind of worked through those, and I had them, imagine like, oh, how would you improve this? What are the barriers to that? So kind of working through that way. And then I had a number of pictures that it's sort of like a modified Rorschach test. And it might be like one of them was a puppet. And so I had them map out their ideal experience when it comes to, faith formation and not ideal. And one children's ministry director I talked to chose the puppet, and for her it was positive because she remembered a story from camp, an intergenerational camp, where this one really shy kid got up and did a puppet show, and everyone affirmed that child, and it actually ended up being a really powerful experience for that child's faith, to be in a leadership role and affirmed for their contribution. Someone else might say, oh, well, I don't want kids to just puppet what they learned in confirmation. So it becomes this open-ended way to help people articulate their hopes, their dreams, and various stories. But each time I'm doing a project, I might develop slightly different sets of participatory tools depending on what questions I'm trying to pursue.
So I think a lot of people are asking about the tools, and sort of what types of ministry challenges are more amenable to addressing questions or prompts through design thinking than others?
I'm biased. I would say we can probably apply design thinking to most issues, especially I would say it's really powerful if you're trying to figure out how to change something. If you're feeling like you're in a rut and that you just continue to go back to either the same people for ideas or the same resources and you're not getting anywhere, I think design thinking can become an excuse to try something new, especially if you can get people on board with the with the process. So, I don't know how helpful that is, but.
A more practical question. If you would recommend one book to introduce leaders in churches to design thinking, what would it be? Or maybe even an exercise. That would be, I always love hands-on. So what would you recommend?
So I would say one book, if you want to go kind of the more academic route, is called Wicked Problems. You can actually, it's Creative Commons license, so you can read it online for free or pay what you want to download it. I think I linked to it from my website resources area. It was published by the students and the faculty at Austin Center for Design. And it's basically, how do you use design to address wicked problems, which are large-scale social problems that don't have easy solutions. It's more complicated than I need a new website. And so it goes through a lot of the design theory. It has some really practical tools in there that you could probably pick and choose a couple and do like a 1 day or even less experience. That's sort of my cheating answer.
Myers Park Presbyterian is on top of it with their questions. How do you encourage design thinking in a context that values a different process?
Do you have like a specific process in mind that you're following?
We will let them respond to that question.
Yeah.
In between, how do you deal with really tight deadlines? Do you fight to make the deadline and or fight to have the time you need on the project? So I'll say that one more time. How do you deal with really tight deadlines? Do you fight to make the deadline and or fight to have the time you need on a project?
It's both. I mean, some of that has depended on the project. Sometimes I've been on a tight time frame because of like the church year or the kind of the calendar year. I've had to rush to try to do projects because I'm trying to catch people before the end of the school year, and people go on summer and they're hard to capture. So I would say you kind of have to figure out what the trade-offs are. I would say any research is better than none. And the great thing too with design research is after talking to 6 to 8 people, you are already identifying trends. So it's not like you have to go out and do like a 2-month vetted, validated research process and have 18 people weigh in on your discussion guide and all of that. Like, you can get out pretty quickly. I mean, I've even done a design process going through the cycle in a half day or 1 day. And at least it sort of breaks you from your ruts. And so I would say even if you're on a tight time frame, a short excursion can show you where your gaps are in thinking or where the possibilities are starting to lie. And then you can determine or maybe justify getting more time.
Myers Park Presbyterian chimed in and they said, how do you encourage design thinking in a context that values a different process? And their example was committees. And I'm gonna voice it just because it's hilarious. Solutions by consensus and opinion.
Yes. So I wonder if you could have like, depending on the problem, maybe you can involve the committee in the process so that I would work with teams where people weren't necessarily responsible for youth ministry, but I would try to pull them into the design process so that they had a stake in what we were doing. And so I would say, like, if you could get the committee involved as researchers and do the process with them, you might actually be able to sort of back your way into a new process, and you might start to reach some consensus because they're part of, hearing the stories, they're part of synthesizing it and generating ideas, so you have more buy-in.
2 recommendations. So Charlotte Greason says, if you're interested in design thinking and looking for more information, finding and attending a design thinking meetup is a good place to start. So sometimes it's better to hear it said out loud rather than under the cascading chat. Daniel Davis also recommended turn a committee into a whiteboard process. Mm-hmm. So, and I love this question. So I think that you're totally the right person to answer it. Richard says, I liked your use of Moses and the burning bush. Any other stories from scripture that you can name that can be used to help people buy into the concept?
Yes. Probably my favorite story that I like to talk about, maybe preach about, is the Syrophoenician woman. In that story, I think it's incredibly powerful that, well, before Jesus encounters the woman, he's just been talking with the Pharisees and had the showdown of, it's not what goes into your mouth that makes you unclean, it's what comes out. And then they go to Phoenicia, which in, I think, Matthew's gospel, they say Canaanite. He meets a Canaanite woman. Canaan was long gone. So this is drawing up years and years of conflict and hatred to basically other this woman. And she pleads for the healing of her daughter. And Jesus just ignores her. He first doesn't even respond to her. The disciples want to send her away because she's shrieking. She is so desperate that she uses his language and says, and pleads to Jesus, son of David. And he says he only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So he is not there for this Gentile woman. Or, as he calls her, this dog. Jesus actually uses a racial slur, or, he calls her a bitch. And in that moment, there is no empathy. But her response, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the master's table. In just one moment, he turns and he then calls her woman. Great is your faith. And the interesting thing is that's this shift from calling her a dog to calling her a woman. Jesus has empathy for her. He heals her daughter. And the only time he actually uses the phrase, great is your faith, in Matthew's gospel is really with this woman. Usually it's about the disciples of little faith. And so there's this complete shift for Jesus, and he's susceptible to empathy. And it changes the trajectory of his ministry, because in Matthew's gospel, after this encounter, he's actually feeding the multitudes, and he now is ministering not just for the lost people of the house of Israel, but to the Gentiles as well. So I think that shows us that if we believe in the incarnation, that Jesus is fully divine and fully human, Jesus is susceptible to empathy. And that's often my call to other people too. How do we develop empathy and question our own assumptions?
I think Judy chimes in and says she is a designer, and she likes to remind people that design is intentional. So starting an initiative or making decisions should be supported by intention as well. So that empathy and bringing people on board rather than dictation. So Michael asks, have you found design thinking to be as effective at honing long traditioned programs as new innovative projects? For example, any illustrations or examples of how to integrate design thinking into annual program calendar of churches?
Yeah, I think if there's a long tradition of what you've been doing, and you're not I would say in most churches, you probably don't have a lot of leeway to start something entirely new. Maybe the exception is like with youth ministry or young adults. That tends to be the experimentation age. But if there's a long-standing tradition, I still think design thinking can be used to sort of invigorate what's happening there, and maybe ask questions about, is this how we want to continue, or how can we prototype and iterate forward without necessarily creating something altogether new.
Shirley chimed in saying that in terms of changing your ministry, like sort of going forward, they use the kingdom metaphor of yeast leavening a loaf to reform the committee. As they processed the story, they made focaccia and soup without recipes. That sounds like a British Bake Off challenge, which is a design thinking challenge.
That's great.
That's wonderful. And Judy recommends using the liturgical season to make changes and try things out.
And I would say certain times, like summer tends to be a slightly more, a time people are more willing to experiment. I would also say Advent and Lent. because they're time boxed. You've got a certain number of weeks. Sometimes you have a little bit more freedom to try something different because you know that you're potentially engaging new people who maybe aren't always as involved. And it's not like you're committing to something for forever. It's a way to pilot something for a short period of time.
Yeah, and what's wonderful, as Lisa points out too, is that it's the life cycle of programs, of curriculum, of committees, of leadership, even that it's sometimes it's good to re-envision and to bring some empathy and sort of new look at things. As she points out, the church is remarkably bad at letting things die. And again, as you so rightly said at the beginning of your presentation, because we've always done it that way is not a good reason.
Well, and one thing I'll add to that too is, it looks like it's this linear process and you always start with this open-ended, ethnographic, generative research. But I didn't really talk about the other kind of research that designers do, which is evaluative, which is what it sounds like. That's more of the testing something out, getting feedback, and that happens often in the prototyping and iteration stage. But maybe that could be an inroad into doing something, a larger design research or design thinking project, because maybe you get a survey or some sort of assessment of a current ministry, you find out a lot of people aren't loving it. Then that can say, okay, let's try to figure out how to address this. Let's go back to the start of the process or this earlier part in the process of open-ended generative research.
And Michael chimes in saying that definitely design thinking prevents a challenge for any leader hoping to guide staff, volunteers, or parishioners into newer and more adaptive forms of planning and ultimately communal life. Oh, I think the communal life part of that comment is so important, that it really is how we interact with each other and how we want to build our community and our kingdom. Any other questions? Yeah, Judy recommends a liturgical season as well. Suzanne chimes in saying design thinking could help with the community gathering. Empathy for older members as well as younger members could result in solutions that honor tradition in a way that is both innovative and reassuring.
I mean, one time I was doing a design thinking workshop for ministry leaders, and we were talking about, like, how do you get rid of the ski trip that, this one church was trying to figure out, like, in their youth ministry, it was this long tradition. And so we said, well, what if you talk to, different generations? And what they ended up finding out is they did this video project, and they discovered that, for some of the parents, the ski trip was really a foundational part of their faith experience that was transformative for them. And so they didn't want to rob their children of that, not realizing that, it might be something different for their kids. And so having those conversations, developing empathy for the parents, help them figure out, well, how do we move forward? How do we frame, how do we think of new ways that we can cultivate those kinds of powerful, transformative moments, but it might not look the same way.
Dan comments with some great rhetorical questions, because they're not questions that are easily answered. What would it look like to enter into the design process on a quarterly basis? What about cultivating a community of practice rather than a community of production? Those are good questions. Does anyone else have any questions, final questions for Bethany? You can chat them in the chat box, or of course type them in the Q&A box as well. Bethany, do you use design thinking to approach personal problems as well as professional problems? Maybe informally.
I think it's just part of my mindset. And so it's so ingrained. I think the reason I'm a designer is because I'm a practical theologian, and the reason I'm a practical theologian is because I'm a designer. I also think that's why I've been often drawn to youth ministry. Most of my work for Spark House was in the youth ministry range, because I think that's where we're given the most permission and space to be creative and innovative and ask questions, and it's also a highly emotional time. So, questions and stories and kind of following emotion is a little bit more, and willingness to experiment is a little more prominent there. So I don't know that I formally follow the design process in other parts of my life, but I think it's the lens through which I see the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bethany, thank you again so much for your time and your guidance and your wisdom sharing design thinking with our eFormation learning community. As I said at the beginning, all of Bethany's resources, her slides, the recording for this workshop, and as well as all of the resources that we've been mentioning in the chat box will also be shared out with our attendees on our eFormation website. And so those will be arriving to you, I think, shortly. It will be, the hardest part will be curating all of our amazing resources and questions that we have been getting through the chat box, and really thanks to all of you for participating. So we are going to go ahead and put our hold slides on. Bethany will be available in the chat box for any other questions that you might have for her, and she can respond to you individually. So thank you again for joining us for this third 3 out of 4 of our workshops for eFormation 2017.